I'm going to read some excerpts from an interesting essay by Rick Salutin that was published in 1999. So it's almost 20 years old, and it was entitled "National Cultures in the Age of Globalization," and it was published in Queen's Quarterly. Now, what Salutin is dealing with is something that seems rather old-fashioned, but it's come back into fashion recently with the publication of André Forget's essay on the need for a great Canadian novel. As a few more reasonable commentators have pointed out, the adjective great is a bit problematical. I mean, you can apply it to a lot of different works that aren't necessarily the social novel, or as Forget puts it, the novel of society. That Forget thinks that Canadian letters really needs. I should say from the outset that I agree very strongly with Forget. I think we need more of these big novels. In fact, I've argued for that in a couple of essays that I've written, and I've got the manuscript. But in any case, this is a debate that has roots that go far, far back. And there are roots in many different cultural communities in Canada. For example, in Lettres Québécois, in First Nations literary circles, etc. There is an interest in culture as an expression of what one could call national identity, or if that term makes you feel uncomfortable, a sort of group identity, a kind of knitting together, a kind of culture that gives a group a particular sense of selfhood. And that's something that I've noticed exists quite a bit over here in Asia, and is something that I admire a lot about Korea. South Koreans and North Koreans now have a very different culture, but they have a historical single root that goes back millennia. And the degree of vitality that exists right now in South Korea culturally is just remarkable. It's amazing. It's something that Canadians could really learn from. In any case, here are some quotes from the Salutin piece because I think they're still timely. Um, One of the most striking phenomena of our times is the increased importance of national cultures in this era of globalization. Given the great disruptions that globalization has occasioned in people's lives everywhere, it is predictable that they should turn to traditional sources of stability and identification. Whatever provides such a resource will be valued, clung to, and, if necessary, resuscitated. We see this with the renewed attachment to religion in our time, from Islamic fundamentalism to the born again Christians of the United States and Latin America. In his series of novels about the end of British rule in India, The Raj Quartet, Paul Scott has a character speculate that the rise of Hindu and Muslim militancy in India during the later years of British rule was due to a, quote, comfort and support, unquote, religion provided in the face of British imperialism. Quote, hit a man in the face long enough, writes Scott, and he turns to his racial memory and his tribal gods, end quote. In other words, modern imperial politics revived religion. In much the same way, you might say that modern global economics has revived national culture and ethnicity along with religion. What I want to stress, however, is the intimate relationship between economic distress or catastrophe and cultural response. I'm thinking here of the argument made by economist Karl Polanyi in his book The Great Transformation, published in 1943. Polanyi, a socialist but not a Marxist, wrote, quote, actually, of course, a social calamity is primarily a cultural, not an economic phenomenon. The disintegration of the cultural environment of the victim is then the cause of the degradation. The economic process may naturally supply the vehicle of the destruction, and almost invariably economic inferiority will make the weaker yield, but the immediate cause of his undoing is not for that reason economic. It lies in the lethal injury to the institutions in which his social existence is embodied. Nothing obscures our social vision as effectively as the economistic prejudice, yet it is precisely this emphasis put on exploitation which tends to hide from our view the even greater issue of cultural degeneration." Unquote. Salutin. He argued that when people feel great economic pressure, they naturally seek some confirmation that their lives make sense, and they look for this within their families and communities. If they can find such reassurance, they are able to withstand remarkable levels of economic deterioration and catastrophe. It is culture which makes sense of people's lives in relation to their community and the history of their community to which they turn. On the other hand, argued Polanyi, if the sense of culture deteriorates, then even if the economic situation in some respects improves, the human results may well be disastrous. He argued, for instance, that this was the case for many Africans sold into slavery. Quote, "Their standard of life in some artificial sense may have improved," unquote. But this was far outweighed by the cultural impoverishment the slaves suffered. A similar fate befell American native peoples moved onto reservations. They may have benefited, quote, "individually according to our financial scale of reckoning, yet the measure all but destroyed the race in its physical existence," end quote. In this light, it seems clear that culture, that which makes sense of our lives, matters to human existence more than purely economic quote-unquote factors. Thus, in an age of severe economic disruption, it is natural for people to turn to their cultures, including national culture, as a resource. Our own Canadian culture is particularly threatened in the present age of globalization. The very nature of national culture in Canada, especially in English-speaking Canada, and the special role of institutions in that culture make it vulnerable, etc. Now, the wording with which these arguments are made, and some of Polanyi's wording is something that could be improved on within a 21st century context. But nevertheless, I think that the arguments that Salutin and Polanyi made are interesting, and I hope that they'll get debated a little bit more in Canadian cultural circles, Quebecois circles, First Nation circles, because the whole issue of the degree to which Canada has a successful series of cultures is debatable. We are one of the nations on Earth which has a very, very weak sense of national culture, and you can see how quickly, and particularly in English Canada, we're swayed by events elsewhere